Welcome everyone to Archetypes in the News for the week of March 4th, 2018. And I thought we would take a look at the Uranus-Pluto and Saturn-Pluto cycles and kind of take a look at the diachronic patterning over the course of the last 200 years for Uranus and Pluto and the last 100 years or so for Saturn-Pluto. And that'll help us understand the Uranus-Pluto revolutionary decade we're in from 2007 to 2020. And the Saturn-Pluto conjunction we're moving into 2018 through 2021. And so, yeah, it'll help contextualize like our decade and what's happening now and where we're moving into. And I thought we would also step back a couple of weeks because so much news has been happening and take a look at the Rob Porter resignation and what the consequences it all led to surrounding that. And the school shooting in Florida. And to contextualize that a little bit, we'll look at Stephen Paddock's chart, the Vegas shooter, and also Omar MATEEN'S chart, the Orlando shooter a couple years ago. So yeah, we'll take a look at those things. And as usual, if you have any comments or questions, please leave them below. And yeah, let's get into it. As we take a look at the Uranus-Pluto diachronic patterns through the past 200 years, we'll see a lot of radical revolutionary decades and a lot of emancipation for both women and for minorities. And then when we look at the Saturn-Pluto cycle, we'll see a lot more of like the crises and the contraction periods and the conservative pullbacks. The Uranus-Pluto is like Pluto empowering Uranus, the revolutionary, emancipation, equality. And the Saturn-Pluto tends towards intensification of conservative pullbacks or boundaries and othering, where we kind of psychological splitting takes place and you project kind of plutonic evil in a sense onto what's outside of one's boundaries. It's also just the weight and constriction of difficult and challenging experiences. It doesn't have to be necessarily in war, but you often see that happening. So let's take a look at the cycle. And the 1787-1798 Uranus-Pluto opposition corresponded to the French Revolution period. It also corresponds to Mary Wollstonecraft's publication of Vindication of the Rights of Woman and the founding of the Abolition Society by Thomas Clarkson in 1787 and the Free Society of Friends of Blacks in France in 1788. Also, the autobiography of the freed slave Ola Aquino was released and widely read in 1789, and the revolution in Haiti that corresponded to the French Revolution, and also all the French colonies were released of their slaves, and Denmark abandoned the slave trade also in 1792. And the Uranus-Pluto conjunction of 1844 to 56, which corresponded to like the gold rush and the founding of San Francisco, but also Frederick Douglass autobiography in 1845, the publication of the North Star paper in 1847, the Underground Railroad flourishes at this point, Harriet Tubman escapes in 1849, Sojourner Truth's autobiography in 1850, Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, founding of the Free Soil Party in 1848, the founding of the Republican Party in 1854, Henry David Thoreau's On the Duty of Civil Disobedience, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels write the Communist Manifesto in 1848, Hermann von Helmholtz's Theory of Conservation of Energy, First Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, 1848. Kelvin and Clausius formulate the second law of thermodynamics. Michael Faraday publishes Thoughts on Ray Vibrations in 1844. James Maxwell uses his work and develops the understanding of electromagnetism with the Faraday-Maxwell equations. Darwin begins writing on the origin of species in 1855. Gregor Mendel begins work on genetics in 1856. And the proliferation of the telegraph, railroads, and steamships and revolutions sweep Europe in 1848 and 49, which were largely driven in ways by the telegraph. So you see the technological evolution of the telegraph being able to transmit information quickly and the information spreading rapidly and the revolutions succeeding in different capitals along with the telegraph information. So at the next opposition in 1896-1907, this corresponded to W.E. Du Bois' first organized black protest, the founding of the Niagara Movement, publication of The Souls of Black Folks in 1903, Booker T. Washington's call for the education of black people, First Pan-African Conference in London, 1900. The founding of the Congo Reform Association in 1904. Women's Social and Political Union in 1903. Founding of the International Women's Suffrage Alliance in 1904. The National American Women's Suffrage Association in 1905. Charlotte Perkins Gilman's Women's in Economics in 1898. Vladimir Lenin's publication of What is to be Done in 1902 in Russia, which led to the Russian Revolution in many ways. Gandhi begins his nonviolent resistance in 1906 in South Africa. Marie Curie becomes the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in 1905. J.J. Thomson discovers the electron in 1897. Max Planck founds quantum mechanics in 1900. Einstein discovers special relativity in 1905. Freud publishes The Interpretation of Dreams in 1900, which is the basic foundation of psychoanalysis. And William Bateson has significant advances in genetics from 1900 through 1910. Wilbur and Orville Wright, first powered flight in 1903. The invention of the Zeppelin in 1900. Benz designs the first internal combustion engine in 1896. And Ransom Olds begins the first automobile production line in 1901. And then the successive square from 1928 through 1937 corresponded to Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington leading the Jazz Revolution, which radically accelerated integration of African Americans in the United States. And there were radical social movements that swept Europe. There's also the rise of Hitler and Stalin. Virginia Woolf's A Room with One's Own. Simone de Beauvoir graduates and begins teaching in 1928. Invention of and rapid rise of the particle accelerator technology, leading to the splitting of the atom in 1932. First nuclear fission by Enrico Fermi in 1934. The jet engine is invented, revolutionizing airplane flight. The rise of Hitler, Stalin, and Mao, and the communist revolutions in Latin America. Social reforms by FDR in response to the Great Depression. So, in the Uranus-Pluto conjunction of the 1960 to 72 period, the radical 60s revolutions, which corresponded to Martin Luther King and the nonviolent civil rights movement, Malcolm X and the founding of the Black Panthers and the Black Power movement, 1968. Women's rights throughout the decade, Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique in 1963. The gay rights movement really begins at Stonewall in 1969. Nelson Mandela begins social insurrection in South Africa. Cultural revolution in China. Radical anti-war protest movements throughout America, beginning rapid evolution of the jet airplane technology, the beginning of the space race in 1961, the formulation of the standard model of particle physics in 1964, Bell's theorem, which is the first mathematical proof of entanglement in 1964, the discovery of quarks in 1968, the first internet transmission, Stanford to UCLA in 1969, the first moon landing in 1969, the flowering of rock and roll, and the counterculture, Woodstock, Altamont, and the Watkins Glen festivals were the most massive music festivals in history, really, and which massive Pluto and Uranus liberating. So all these liberating the massive energies, both the massive energy of like space flight to go to the moon, that type of thing. You see that in its archetypal energy. It comes through in all different ways. So the Uranus-Pluto of our current decade, 2007 through 2020. The invention of the smartphone, the iPhone, has been 2007. The election of the first black president in 2008. Black Lives Matter movement. Gay marriage. Widespread change in attitudes for legalization of marijuana. The Arab Spring and revolutionary Middle East uprisings. Occupy Wall Street movement. The first woman to win National Political Party nomination. The first woman to win the popular vote in a national election. The Tea Party Revolution. The election of the first president never to hold public office, political office of any kind. The Higgs boson is discovered, which is a completion of the Standard Model, and happened in 2012. And entangled particles are teleported 1,200 kilometers by Chinese scientists. That's just this last year. Quantum computing begins, and really in earnest, like lots of money is being funneled into it now. And the civilian-funded space exploration continues, revolutionary milestones. Chinese scientists put a rover on the moon for the first time since the 60s. Rapid development of virtual reality and artificial intelligence, and artificial intelligence, but virtual reality has even gone so far as to be integratable with a smartphone, which haven't done, but I've seen it as possible. So, and this is also the possible early stages of the blockchain currency revolution, which really fascinating situation where, you know, blockchain currency could actually become more legit than, you know, fiat currency, which is just money, paper, which is harder to track than blockchain. So who knows what's going to happen over this the next 3 years. So now we'll take a look at the Saturn-Pluto cycles through the 20th century, and we'll begin with the 1913-1916 conjunction, which corresponded to World War I and the over 16 million people killed, and that initiated a massive shift in political power dynamics around the world. It also is the founding of the Federal Reserve Bank in the United States. And the 1930 to 33 opposition corresponded to the Great Depression, the rise of the Nazi Party, and the beginning of Hitler's dictatorship, Stalin's starvation of 7 million Ukrainians, and the rise of the Japanese military invasion and the invasion of Manchuria and China. The Saturn-Pluto square of 1939 to 1941 corresponds to Hitler's invasion of Poland at the beginning of World War II, the Blitzkrieg and the fall of France, the beginning of the final solution and the Holocaust, which killed over 11 million people, and the beginning of the Manhattan Project in response to Hitler's taking over Europe. And the Saturn-Pluto conjunction that followed World War II, it's interesting because the World War I was a conjunction, and then it goes through, and the end of World War II after the square is the next conjunction, which is the beginning of the Cold War, which is kind of the next major war, world war in a sense, and the beginning of the Cold War and the nuclear arms race, the establishment of the Iron Curtain, the establishment of the CIA, the retraction of the British Empire after World War II, and the rise of the United States and the Soviet Union. Beginning of the modern age of terrorism, actually, when the Zionist Irgun bombed the King David Hotel in 1946, the first Arab-Israeli war with the founding of Israel in 1948, and the India-Pakistan War in 1947 when India gained its independence from the British Empire. This is also when apartheid was instituted in South Africa. And the Saturn-Pluto square of 1954 to 56 was the second Arab-Israeli conflict, the Suez Canal War, which happened in 1956, and the Soviet Union reoccupied Hungary, and the Soviet Union also crushed an uprising in Poland in that 3-year period. And the Saturn-Pluto opposition from 64 to 68 corresponded to the massive escalation in the Vietnam War from 64 to 65, the Arab-Israeli Six-Day War in 1967, and nearly 1 million Indonesians were slaughtered by right-wing militias in Indonesia, and that corresponded to the barbaric terrorism of Mao's Red Guard in China. And the Saturn-Pluto square of 73-74, this is corresponding to the Yom Kippur Arab-Israeli War in 1973, the energy crisis that resulted in the United States because of that, because of our support of Israel and OPEC's boycott of the United States, and the U.S. defeat in Vietnam, the Watergate crisis, Nixon's resignation, the constitutional crisis that was just barely avoided, and over 1 million Cambodians slaughtered by the Khmer Rouge when we pulled out of Vietnam, and the CIA overthrow of the government, democratically elected government, Allende and Chile, and it was a coup d'etat, and they inserted Augusto Pinochet as a dictator, ironically on September 11th, 1973, which he ruled by an iron hand for the next 30 years, I believe, and ultimately was sentenced in England. But in 1980 through 84, this is the next conjunction, Saturn-Pluto conjunction, and corresponded to the end. I mean, it's like the peak of the Cold War in a sense. It's the last of the nuclear arms buildup between the two countries, and it also is just prior to Gorbachev coming to power and the beginning of Glasnost. So it was like the peak of the Cold War. It's also the first fundamentalist Islam suicide attack against the West at the Marine Barracks bombing in 1983. This is also corresponded to the Iran-Iraq War, the beginning of the Iran-Iraq War and the most intense part of it. the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, the creation of Hezbollah as a result. Reagan deregulated the banks at this point. It's really fascinating, and which began the United States experiment in a credit economy, which I believe the credit card was created in the late 1970s, and then there's deregulation happened, and basically we've been living out this experiment for the last 40 years. So conjunction then, and then we're about to go through the next conjunction, which will be interesting to look at. So in the next square, from 92 to 94, the first World Trade Center bombing, so the next major terrorist attack against the West, bin Laden's call for jihad against the United States, Bill Clinton's assault weapons ban, which actually led to the conservative takeover of Congress for the first time in 50 years. The exit polls showed that the assault weapons ban that Clinton had instituted was the main reason why people voted for Republicans, specifically in the rural South and in the rural areas of America, which is what led to the Republican takeover for the first time in 50 years. And then Newt Gingrich's contract with America, and then the genocide in Rwanda, and it's also corresponded to the rise of power of the Taliban in Afghanistan. And then the Saturn-Pluto opposition from 2000 to 2004, the 9/11 World Trade Center attack, the insinuating wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. This is also when Putin took power in Russia, went to war in Chechnya to maintain his power. This is when the Patriot Act and the NSA had the Total Information Awareness Office that was quickly removed, but got just absorbed into the NSA, which later Edward Snowden revealed that the United States had been spying on Americans ever since 9/11. So the Saturn-Pluto square of 2008 to 2011 corresponded to the subprime mortgage economic collapse, which was the worst recession since the Great Depression. Obama's surge in Afghanistan kind of heightened the war there. He got kind of tricked into it really by the Pentagon. And this is also the beginning of the Syrian civil war, and which over 11 million people have been displaced from that conflict, and over 500,000 people killed, I believe, civilians killed. So it's also the largest refugee crisis since World War II. And this brings us to our current 2018 through 2021 Saturn-Pluto conjunction. So again, we get like another, conjunctions are the end of a cycle and the beginning of a cycle. So you see like the beginning World War I, then like the end happens after the last square at World War II, and then the beginning of the Cold War, then kind of the end of the Cold War at the conjunction of 84, and that is also the beginning of the war on terrorism, Islamic fundamentalists attacking the West anyway, and then our responses ultimately. And so that began at in the 80 to 84 period, and then major conflict crises have come out of the last cycle, and then now we are entering into the next conjunction, which is the end of the cycle and the beginning of a new one. And it corresponds right now, we can tell, to a widespread conservative and authoritarian consolidation of power in Russia and China and Turkey and Hungary, a possible trade war that Trump just labeled, as bringing tariffs with steel and aluminum. This corresponds to the Russian continued meddling in the United States elections and our social media situation, and the potential for them to throw into question the legitimacy of our 2018 elections. So you can just imagine, like, irrespective of who wins, if the Democrats take power or not, if it's in dispute, where are we as a country and our ability to handle this unknowability of what's real, what should be, what's truth. I mean, I talk about a constitutional crisis. It's pretty unbelievable what may happen there. So yeah, and possible constitutional crisis in the United States, and the unprecedented partisan division that you see now. You see many people talk about it like they've never seen it this bad. Trump really is exacerbating it. I felt like when he was going to lose the election, I thought he was going to say it was rigged, and he was going to, it was going to be this kind of low-grade civil war between believers and non-believers, and now it's just going to be worse. I mean, he's compromised the Republican Party. He's got, people who, you kind of thought maybe had some integrity before this, but they've just been completely compromised. They don't have any backbone. They can't stand up to him. They know he's lying. And I think they're going down with him. Like, if that happens, it'll be hard for them to say, oh yeah, whatever now, because I mean they should have been doing this a long time ago. So anyway, this is where we're at this point, and I thought it was helpful, it could be helpful for us to look at the past and what's been going on and take a look at what's going on now. And now we'll take a look at the Rob Porter scandal, which happened 3 weeks ago on February 6th, and he was the right-hand man to John Kelly. He was in charge of bringing the classified information to the president, so he's in a really high-level position, but he had not cleared his full background check. And the revelation of this exposed over 100 other White House officials who had not cleared their background checks, including Jared Kushner. So what's really fascinating is the reason that the Rob Porter scandal came about is because he had abused 2 of his ex-wives, and he's born with the sun in a square to the planet Mars. And you see that in a really shadow form, with the potential for someone to be overly aggressive and combative by nature. He's also born with Saturn in a really tight semi-square to Pluto, which you see with people who have like more super egoic restriction and the potential for a need for control. And when it's intensified by Pluto, it can be a high level of rigidity that, like, he was seen as being extremely grounded and practical and organized as a worker, and you can tell he just holds himself with this like rigidity, but there's a lot of shadow that's being repressed ultimately and came out in his violent actions towards women. And the Venus, he's born with Venus-Pluto conjunction, which you see a lot with Pluto being wanting control, in this case, of the feminine or of women in his life, and it's also in an opposition to the moon. It's a noon chart, but any time that day it would be in opposition to the moon. So again, you can see controlling, a need for control, or the potential for abuse with the feminine or against the feminine, or the suppression of one's own emotions, and then the reactionary impulse that comes from the repression, and in his case coming through in this Sun square Mars. So really interestingly, though this is his transits, Saturn is just moving into a square to his natal Venus, so it's squaring that part of his chart that corresponds to the women in his life and that repressed dimension and secret. Pluto corresponds to the secrets, of the secret dimensions of his relationships that weren't aware to us and now come to our awareness because of the judgment and the criticism and the law and his exposure to it, which is all Saturn. So yeah, he's born Saturn square Venus Pluto. I'm sorry, this is by transits. He resigned, and because of the black eye pictures, it's interesting that John Kelly actually knew about this since 2017, but we'll see what happens to him. It really shouldn't have taken this long. So HIcks was dating, or is still dating, I believe, Rob Porter, and she is the White House communications director. She testified a couple days ago that she has at times told white lies for Trump. And what's interesting is that Saturn in her chart is squaring to her natal Mercury, and it's on her natal Neptune. And she's going through her Saturn return. But what's interesting is this is the same alignment that Trump is born with. He's born with Mercury square Neptune. And I just found this fascinating that she, being his communications director, and in some way, you know, like, she's been the person that seems to have the most confidence in Trump, like in the most faith, or has been the most faithful, the most loyal to him. And a lot of people are worried that she's not going to be there to kind of help him through his challenging moments. And what's interesting is just that same Mercury Neptune, that capacity to kind of, in the shadow form, to believe in someone's stream of consciousness, to not necessarily need facts, to be very logical and grounded. And it's an ability to swim with whatever's in the flow of the field. So she seems to have been perfect for that, for Trump. And interestingly, Jared Kushner, this is his natal chart. He's born with the Sun Mercury conjunction square Pluto, so, and Jupiter. So he has a wide Sun Jupiter square, and brought closer together with the Sun square to Pluto. And you see it both with the wealth, but just like the power, but then like the secret dealings. He's quiet, but he's got a lot of secret stuff going on. He was, I guess, tired. He tried to set up back channels with the Russians during the transition. He's been doing secret dealings, trying to get himself out, him and his family out of debt. It was like $1 billion, I believe, for the 666 property on Fifth Avenue. And what's taking place by his transits is really interesting. He has Pluto conjoining his sun, and I think, you can kind of see that as like him taking the role, even taking the job, and wanting to use it to manipulate. And from what I understand, his family has taken over $500 million in loans since the election, and very likely Jared was responsible for the blockade against Qatar as a retaliation for the failed business transaction on 666 Fifth Avenue, because he was trying to get them to invest in it, and they backed out. And then there was this whole hiccup or big deal where there was a blockade put on Qatar, and no one kind of understood why. And Tillerson was against it, and Mattis was against it. It's just it kind of seems as though it was actually just like payback that Kushner was wanting to have against the Qatarians. So anyway, all this leads to Kushner failing his background check, and he loses his top security clearance. He no longer is allowed to get the top secret security info. So fascinating series of events. The White House is losing people left and right, and they're the most closest people to Donald Trump. So it's getting crazy in there. But I wanted to take a look at the shooting situation and the kind of the consequences that may come out of it. So, but to contextualize that, we'll first look at Stephen Paddock. He was the Las Vegas shooter, and he's born with Mars square Pluto, 14 Taurus to 20 Leo, and he's born with the Sun trine Pluto, but he's also born with the Sun opposite Saturn Neptune. You sometimes see with Saturn Neptune people who are interested in mental health, that work in mental health fields, because Neptune's the stream and flow of consciousness, and Saturn can be pathology or in service of working with pathological streams and flows of consciousness. But it also can just be a difficult stream and flow of consciousness where a lot of pathology can seep in, a lot of pessimistic thinking, a lot of really dark thinking, like where you have dark visions, you have dark imagery, dark dreams. The one thing that I got from his wife is that he was waking up in the middle of the night with nightmares and wouldn't talk about them. So Saturn represses the dreams, represses talking about them. They're the nightmarish dream, but he's repressing talking about them or making them public. And this is the most interesting situation because no one can figure out why he did what he did. There's no motive, there's no note. It's just that it seems like for a year he started building up weapons, and then he went to Las Vegas and shot 58 people, and it's the largest mass shooting in American history. And he's born, like I said, with the Mars square Pluto, Sun, Saturn, Uranus. But what's really interesting is that when the shooting took place, Mars was in a trine to Pluto, just 1 degree from exact, which was forming a grand trine with his natal Mars within 3 degrees. 3 degrees from Mars to Mars, and 2 degrees from Pluto to Mars. So the most successful mass shooting in history corresponds to a grand trine, the most harmonious relationship you can get between Mars, the shooter, the gun, and Pluto, the intensity to actually cause mass destruction and death. So, unfortunately, this was part of what was the dynamics that were just informing his psyche at the time. But Uranus was opposite his natal Saturn, which, interestingly, you see a lot with breakdowns, like a crack. The sudden, unexpected breakdown of Saturn, of the structures of one's psyche in this case, or his sense of reality, or kind of his hold on a sane grip of reality. And then we'll take a look at Omar Mateen. He was the nightclub shooter in Orlando, and he's born with the Sun square to Mars, and really in a T-square with the Moon. Again, a noon chart, but it would have been in the T-square at any point in the day. And more importantly, really, really interestingly, the Sun is at the exact midpoint of Saturn and Pluto. and so it brings the Saturn-Pluto alignment, or it brings the Saturn-Pluto energy right onto his sun. So you see this sense of constriction, or boundaries, or wanting to destroy what is seemingly other, and the fact that Mars is exactly square to that point in his chart. It's square to his natal sun, which is the midpoint of Saturn and Pluto. So he has Mars, Saturn, Pluto again really tightly. And then, interesting, Neptune is at the midpoint of Mercury and Mars. So you get fantasies, potentially delusional fantasies of Mars-Mercury ideation, mental ideation of wanting to kill in this case. Doesn't have to come through that way, but it happened to. And on the day of the shootings, interestingly, Mars was exactly conjoining his natal sun within 1 degree, square to his natal Mars, and at the midpoint of his Saturn-Pluto midpoint. And he was going through his Saturn return as well. So really fascinating alignments there. But then Nikolas Cruz, he is the shooter at Parkland in Florida, and he is born with Mars at the Saturn-Pluto midpoint as well. Here it is, Mars at the Saturn-Pluto midpoint, just 3 degrees from exact, and he's also born with the Saturn square Neptune. Saturn here is square to Neptune, and obviously mentally disturbed. His Facebook posts were like, "I think I'm going to be a school shooter." I mean, it's so sad. That's obviously a cry for help. He's like basically saying, "Hey, please help me. I'm going mad and I'm having these crazy visions." But that was, you know, the way he could say it. And interestingly, when the transits happened, when the school shooting took place, Saturn in the sky was square to his natal sun Mercury conjunction. So the consequences of his actions being felt for everyone, but in a sense, like he'll be suffering with those consequences for eternity in this lifetime, that's for sure. But Mars was also in a wide conjunction with his natal Pluto at the time of the shooting. So again, oh, and one other thing, Uranus had just moved into a conjunction with his Saturn. So it had moved to 28, so just 4 degrees off of Saturn earlier in the year. And again, like the sudden break, the similar transit was happening for Stephen Paddock. You get the Uranus wants to break free of the constraints of the mental disturbances. In this case, it's like you're having mental disturbances, and Uranus wants to liberate, but it does it in these sudden, unexpected ways, and breakdown of the mental structures that were holding one's sanity in place, that type of thing. So again, those are that type of energies in one of their manifestations. So what can we take from all this? This is the Saturn-Pluto conjunction that we're entering into, and what I'm kind of I have a lot of hope around is possible gun control measures. You know, it really hasn't happened, and everyone is really doubtful, but the fact that you have stores saying they're not going to sell these weapons, you have credit cards potentially saying we're not going to allow them to be sold with our credit cards. You also have the moral backbone, the Saturnian moral backbone of the children, which is interesting. The kids that are juniors to freshmen, they're all born during the Saturn-Pluto opposition of 9/11. So they have this, they've lived with it throughout their lives. School shootings, that is, they've always existed since Columbine, and they are seeming to embody like the moral strength of Saturn intensified by Pluto to take on the government, to take on the elders, to speak their truth and not to back down is definitely the energy we're getting from them. We'll see what happens, but and it's interesting, they want safety restrictions, Saturn on the guns, Pluto, you know, they want common sense Saturnian safety measures put on what are lethal weapons. So another thing I think is happening, we have a civil war of rhetoric in the United States. I've never seen it this bad, and if Trump goes down in really difficult fashion, and he goes down swinging, then the people who believe him, and the people who don't may find themselves in clashes. So, and we do seem to be in a cyber war with Russia, although it is rather one-sided at the moment. Trump has failed to do anything to try and counter their measures, and honestly, it's treasonous behavior. The fact that our commander-in-chief is not trying to protect us from the next possible interfered with election it's unbelievable. And yeah, so the last thing, the possible restructuring of the world order, political world order, you kind of see it, the World War I, and after World War II, and then after the fall of the communism and, well, the Soviet Union, but it really didn't happen until after, but it began in the early 80s with Reagan. So interestingly, all of those things, the terrorism cycle, all of those things are coming to a head, it seems, some type of culmination and new beginning. So all of that corresponds to the Saturn-Pluto, and it's intensified with radical revolutionary fervor, and with the Uranus-Pluto square that we're all in as well. So hope this has been helpful this week. I really wanted to just kind of contextualize a lot of where we've been, where we're going, I mean, how we got here, and so that we can have a better idea of what's happening now and how we want to navigate the waters to the future. So yeah, please leave any questions or comments you have in the comments below, and we'll talk again soon. Okay, take care. Bye.